It is not easy to live on. Could do with a lot more.
So the opportunity to wipe out slum areas like this.
Because in Belfast, houses are more than just places to live in.
Your couch was wrapped in plastic, your dinner came from a can, and the sound of rabbit ear static meant you didn't have much. But somehow, it still felt like home. What did we lose when being poor in the 1980s stopped looking like survival and started being erased from memory? If you had a television in the 1980s and it only showed black and white, it said something before you ever touched the dial. Those rabbit ears on top, bent, twisted, wrapped in foil like they had gone to war and lost. You would fidget with them for 15 minutes just to see a single clear frame. And God forbid someone walked across the room and knocked the signal out again. A family huddled around static, trying to catch the evening news or a rerun of Gilligan's Island in blurry gray. This was not just entertainment. It was an escape. A battered TV with no remote and a channel knob that clicked like it was trying to hold itself together was often the centerpiece of a living room you could barely afford to heat. The screen would hum with ghostly noise when no one was watching, filling the silence with electric whispers. This was your portal to a world that did not look like yours, and that mattered more than the fuzz on the screen. In those flickering black and white frames, you saw dreams dressed in Technicolor. And even with the black and white haze and those stubborn antennas, you clung to it. Because having cable meant luxury. Color television meant status. And if you were lucky, you could squint through the fuzz and pretend for just a moment that your living room looked like the ones you saw on screen. But deep down, you knew it did not. That screen was small, but the distance between your world and theirs felt endless. You did not sit on the couch. You sat on the plastic on the couch. Every sticky summer day, your thighs would peel off like cheese from a grilled sandwich. The covers squeaked, creaked, and groaned with every movement. It was not just a furniture choice, it was a financial strategy. That couch had to last. You could not afford a new one. Maybe it was handed down from someone who could, or picked up from a neighbor's sidewalk with a quiet prayer that it had not seen too much. But the plastic covers, they were a statement. A loud, crinkly one. They told guests, "This is all we have, and we are going to protect it like gold." You were not decorating. You were defending. That plastic was your insurance policy against time, kids, and chance. The air under the plastic was always warmer, damper, and just a little sad. If you were a kid, you hated it. But if you were a parent, you understood. The stains, the spills, the sharp corners of life, they had to bounce off something. The cover was armor for your dignity. Guests would pretend not to notice, but everyone knew what it meant. The plastic turned your living room into a museum. Look, but do not touch. Comfort took a back seat to preservation. You were not lounging. You were preserving history, one suffocating square foot at a time. Because replacing a couch was not an option. Covering it in shiny, suffocating plastic, that was survival. Step into a poor household in the 1980s, and you would be greeted by the warm, fake hug of wood paneling. It was always too dark, like a basement that forgot it was part of the house. The linoleum under your feet peeled at the edges, curling up like it was trying to escape. These design choices were not really choices at all. They were cheap, affordable, easy to install, easy to ignore. The paneling had that glossy finish that tried to look rich but felt more like cardboard wearing a tuxedo. It echoed every sound, too. Your footsteps, your fights, your late-night fridge raids. Linoleum was no better. It cracked under pressure, bubbled near the oven, and held onto dirt like it was saving it for later. It was home improvement without the improvement. But when you are poor, the only thing that really has to shine is your pride. You would drag a chair across the floor and it would scream with every inch. But it was all you had. Hardwood floors and tiled backsplashes lived in the glossy pages of Sears catalogs and the dreams of people who did not use Layaway. You made do. You told yourself it was cozy. You rearranged the furniture to hide the worst parts. A throw rug here, a makeshift mat there, and sometimes when the light hit it just right, it looked like something out of a real home. At least until the illusion faded again. Heat in the 1980s was not something you escaped. it was something you endured. Poor meant you did not have central air. You had fans, one in the window that never really fit, another that oscillated like it was too tired to commit. You would lay still at night, drenched in sweat, praying for a breeze that never came. Ice trays became currency. Cold washcloths went on foreheads like war bandages. And opening the front door was not just about fresh air, it was survival. Kids played outside not because it was fun, but because it was cooler in the shade than it was inside. You kept the curtains closed, the lights off, and your patience thinner than your summer sheets. You were not just sweating, you were surviving. The summer heat became your constant, suffocating roommate. You might have visited someone who had air conditioning and wondered how they lived in such luxury. Cooled air, dry clothes, no noise but the gentle hum of comfort. Back at home, the sound was different. It was the buzz of old fans, the click of sweaty skin, the low groan of a family trying to pretend the heat was not a problem. You slept in front of that fan like it was a life raft, but it was not enough, and there was nothing you could do about it. You knew they were not yours. The clothes, they never fit right. The sleeves too long, the waist too tight, the colors faded like they had seen too many summers. But you wore them anyway, because new clothes were for birthdays, maybe Christmas, if you were lucky. Everything else was a gift from someone else's past. A cousin, an older sibling, a neighbor who outgrew it. Each outfit carried someone else's story stitched into the seams. Maybe you even remembered seeing them wear it, wondering how long until it became yours. And when it did, you felt equal parts lucky and ashamed. Kids at school noticed. They always noticed. The brands were outdated, the styles were wrong. You did not wear a fashion trend, you wore someone else's memories, and you walked through the day hoping no one recognized the past you were draped in. You walked a little faster, hoping no one would ask where you got it, or worse, who wore it before you. But still, your parents folded those clothes with pride, because hand-me-downs meant they were keeping you warm, dressed, and somewhat dignified without going broke. That mattered more than looking cool. You learned how to make old look new. You learned how to stretch. And somehow, you survived in second-hand fabric. Threadbare, but strong. They did not come with tags, but they came with a different kind of value. The packaging said it all. A white label, plain black letters, just the name of what was inside. Cornflakes, peanut butter, beans. No mascot, no shiny promise of flavor, just facts. The generic aisle at the grocery store was not where you went for choice. It was where you went when you had none. These were the products no kid wanted to pull from their lunchbox. They were loud in their plainness. Your friends had sugary cereals with cartoons on the box. You had a mystery bag of cereal that promised sweetened puffs and nothing more. But the price was right, sometimes half as much, and that meant you could buy twice as many. Parents told themselves there was no difference. It all tastes the same, they said. But deep down, everyone knew branding mattered. The plain label shouted something your family never said out loud. We cannot afford the one with color. You swallowed more than just cereal. You swallowed a quiet kind of shame. It made you feel like you belonged. And when all you had were the no-name cans at the bottom shelf, you felt something else entirely. But you ate it anyway, because you had to. The label did not matter as much as the fact that it was food. And in a poor household, that was enough. Identity did not come in packaging. It came in survival. It was never really milk, not in taste, not in texture. But when the real thing got too expensive, powdered milk became the go-to stand-in. Mixed with water in a pitcher that always looked cloudy, it sat in the fridge like a silent compromise. Kids could tell, they always could, the cereal tasted off. The chocolate syrup never mixed right. And drinking it plain, that was a punishment. But it was cheap. That mattered. When you bought powdered milk, you bought time. Time between paychecks. Time between full-price grocery trips. It had a shelf life longer than most of your optimism. It didn't just stretch your grocery bill, it tested your pride. Every sip reminded you this wasn't what other kids had, but it was what you had to get by. It was the kind of thing you hoped would not run out. but also hoped you would not have to drink. You learned to hide the taste with sugar, with syrup, with hope. Sometimes you would go to a friend's house and drink real milk and realize just how much you were missing. Then you would come home, open the fridge, and stare down that pale, ghostly jug again. Powdered milk did not just stretch $1, it stretched your tolerance. You could smell it before you opened the box. A big orange brick. No label, no brand, just cheese. It came from the government, which made it sound official, but it felt more like a secret. You stood in long lines at the community center or church basement to get it. People avoided eye contact. No one wanted to admit they were there for the same reason. When you got home, the block was heavy, dense, like a promise that this week might be okay. It did not melt like normal cheese. It clung to pans, stuck to knives, and burned if you looked at it wrong. But it was cheese. It worked. Grilled cheese, casseroles, sandwiches for school. It made plain bread feel like a meal. It didn't taste like comfort food, but it was comfort. And when things were really bad, even that brick felt like a small miracle. And for families that had little else, that was everything. The taste became familiar, then comforting, maybe even nostalgic. It was a flavor tied to both struggle and safety. You never forgot that box, or how it felt to need it. Lunch meat was a luxury. Processed meat, that was the reality. Spam in a can, bologna in a plastic sleeve. They were the same salty, rubbery promise that you could make a sandwich, even if the bread was stale and the mayonnaise was thinning out. Fry it in a pan and suddenly it smelled like dinner. Cold or hot, it filled the plate and the belly. Kids brought it to school, wrapped in wax paper or old sandwich bags that barely held together. You could hear the judgment before the first bite, but you still ate it because you were hungry. And because that bologna, as weird as it was, tasted like home. Spam was even more of a marvel. Pull the key, peel back the metal, and there it was. Mystery meat molded to perfection. Fried spam and eggs, spam and rice, spam with macaroni. You did not question what was inside, you were just thankful something was. It was the flavor of survival, sealed in a metal rectangle. You made it stretch, you made it last. It was not glamorous, but it was yours. And in a world that often left you out of everything, that meant something. If you did not have oil, you had lard. If you did not have lard, you had bacon grease. Stored in an old coffee can on the stove, the grease was gold. Not just for flavor, but for survival. You used it to fry eggs, toast bread, season beans. A spoonful here, a dollop there. It sizzled like applause in a quiet kitchen. Butter was too expensive. Oil was too fancy. But grease? Grease was earned. It came from the meals before. The bacon you had on Sunday if you were lucky. It was the gift that kept on giving, and it made everything taste like more than it was. In homes where every dollar mattered, grease was the secret ingredient. You did not throw it away, you honored it. That can of fat was both seasoning and sacrifice. The smell of it cooking could bring the whole house to life. It was humble, gritty, and absolutely essential. It was poverty's perfume. There was a line, and if you were in it, everyone knew what it meant. You had the little colored ticket, the one that got you a tray without cash. Or maybe your name was just on a list, quietly marked by the lunch lady with tired eyes and no judgment left. But the other kids noticed, and that kind of notice sticks. A free lunch was supposed to mean relief, and it did, for the parents. It meant one less meal to worry about. But for the kids, it felt like wearing a sign. The food itself was never the point. Chicken nuggets, canned peaches, milk in a little carton, none of it mattered. What mattered was the subtle way poverty announced itself between the lunch tables. Some kids avoided the line altogether. They would rather go hungry than be that kid. Others owned it, laughed it off, acted like it did not bother them. But it did. Because when you are poor in the 1980s, even a sandwich is a symbol. And when lunch becomes a currency for belonging, the free one often costs the most. You did not get to choose your style. Your style was whatever still had seams. Too short pants with stretched out knees, collars from another decade, sneakers that flapped when you walked. The school hallways were a runway whether you liked it or not. And some of us showed up wearing last year's failures. You told yourself the color was still fine. You hoped no one noticed the patch your mom ironed on, but kids are sharp. They know what is new. And more importantly, they know what is not. Fashion in the 1980s exploded with loud patterns and bright branding. Everyone wanted to be seen, unless you were poor. Then you wanted to disappear. Hand-me-downs that hung off your shoulders. Jackets too light for winter. T-shirts with logos from defunct grocery stores. You played it cool. You joked about being retro before retro was cool. But inside, it stung. Not because the clothes were ugly, but because they were not yours. They were leftovers. And even if you did not say it, you knew what that meant. Being poor meant your body had to adjust to the clothes, not the other way around. And every loose thread was a reminder that someone else got to outgrow what you were still trying to grow into. You did not join the team. You did not sign up for the club, not because you did not want to, but because you could not. There was a form, a fee, a uniform, a ride, always something just out of reach. Football pads cost too much. Dance lessons were a joke. Even the art club needed supplies your house did not have. You watched from the sidelines, you clapped at games, you listened to your friends talk about practice and tryouts and trophies, you smiled, you cheered, but you were never in it. After school, you went straight home. Sometimes to babysit, sometimes because there was no one to pick you up. The locker rooms, the backstage, the huddles and uniforms, they were like a secret world that never had space for you. Poor in the 1980s meant more than missing meals. It meant missing moments. No yearbook photos and jerseys, no ribbons or trophies gathering dust on your shelf. Just memories of what you almost had, and questions about who you might have been if the price tag had not gotten in the way. There were no movie nights, no game systems, no cable, but there was the library. That big, quiet building down the street was everything. It was free. It was warm, and no one asked why you were there. You could disappear between the shelves and come back with a stack of Escape, Nancy Drew, Goosebumps, Hardy Boys, magazines from last year, encyclopedias no one checked out, but you read anyway just to feel smart. They had story time for kids, free movies once a month, and maybe, if you were lucky, computers that ran like tired robots. The library was your ticket out, even if only for a few hours. No need to explain why you visited so often. You were not just reading, you were surviving. When your parents could not afford trips or tickets or toys, the library filled the gap. It made you feel richer than you were. And for a lot of us, it was the first place that ever made us feel seen, because the books did not care what you wore or what you ate. They just opened, and they let you in. There were no drop-offs, no car doors opening to say goodbye. You walked, rain, snow, sun, whatever the sky decided, you just walked, or biked if you had one, not the shiny kind with pegs and stickers, the rusted kind. The hand-me-down two-wheeler with crooked handlebars and squeaky brakes, no helmet, no backup plan. The route to school became muscle memory. Past the same houses, same potholes, same barking dog. You learned how to make it to the front steps before the late bell rang, even if your shoes were soaked and your fingers numb. No one really asked why, everyone kind of knew. No gas money, no second car, no parent home in the morning to drive you. It was not dramatic. It was just how it was. If your friends got rides, you waved from the sidewalk, and maybe they waved back, maybe they looked away. Walking to school taught you more than just time management. It taught you to move through the world on your own 2 feet, even when they hurt. You waited your turn, always. And by the time you got it, the water was cold and murky. But it was still a bath. The first kid in got the best of it, the second made do, the third rinsed off in someone else's week. It was not gross. It was normal. Water was expensive, heating it even more so. Baths were not about luxury. They were about rationing. 1 tub, 1 bucket of hot water. 3 kids, maybe more. You learned to bathe in silence with no complaints because silence was cheaper than hot water. Clean wasn't about comfort, it was about calculation. You scrubbed fast, you never splashed. Soap was passed like a baton, towels reused until they barely absorbed. This was not about being dirty, it was about surviving clean. Poor meant you counted the cost of every drop. And privacy? That was a different kind of luxury. You laughed about it later, maybe, but at the time it taught you something. How to wait, how to stretch, how to make do with less, way less. The water might have been shared, but the lesson was yours alone. It sat in a cracked plastic dish. One tired bar, faded, nicked, sometimes split down the middle, but it did everything. Your body wash, your shampoo, your dish soap, your laundry detergent, sometimes even your stain remover. It smelled like nothing and everything all at once. Not fancy, not fragrant, just soap. You lathered up in cold water, hoping it was enough. Scrubbed dishes with it when the real detergent ran out. Rubbed it on a washcloth to clean your shoes. It was your universal cleaner, your silent workhorse, the only luxury you could actually afford. That tiny bar lived longer than half the clothes in the closet. Some families even shaved bits off to make it last longer. There were no bubbles, no spa moments, no fresh scents promising ocean breezes or rainforest mist. Just a bar. And a need. In stores, you walked past entire aisles of specialty products, shelves full of bottles promising magic. But you knew the truth. That little square was a workhorse, cheap, dependable, and always just barely enough. Soap was not self-care. It was a survival tool. You did not pamper. You washed. Kitchen chairs doubled as barber shops, towels around your neck, scissors older than you. A nervous parent standing behind you saying, "Hold still." Homemade haircuts were a gamble. Sometimes you got lucky. Sometimes it looked like a lawnmower ran wild on your scalp. But salons cost money, and barbers charged by the head, not by the hardship. So your family learned to snip and trim, guided by hope and a picture from a magazine. There was no mirror check, no styling gel, no second opinion. Just a haircut that said, "We tried our best with what we had." Bangs too short. Uneven sideburns. A bowl cut so literal it might have actually involved a bowl. You went to school pretending it was intentional. Your friends laughed. You laughed louder. What else could you do? It was cheaper to cut it all off than pay to fix a mistake. Some kids avoided haircuts altogether. Let it grow. Let it cover. But eventually, the scissors came back. And every cut came with the same unspoken message. This is what we can afford. You learned to live with it. You even got used to it. But you never forgot the feeling of looking in the mirror and wondering who you might have looked like if money had never been a problem. That scarf your grandma made? It was love in yarn form. But also, it was all you had. Sweaters with sleeves that sagged, hats that itched, gloves without mates. You wore them anyway. They were handmade, which meant they were priceless, but also impossible to trade for something trendier. While your classmates had brand-name jackets with neon logos, you had a cardigan the color of mustard and maroon. It stood out. It always stood out. You told people it was vintage. You hoped they believed you. You wrapped yourself in the stitches of someone's time, someone's care, someone's refusal to let you be cold. It wasn't fashionable, but it was love you could wear. But you knew. Hand-knitted clothes told a different story. One of care, one of necessity. Someone spent hours making that sweater because they could not afford to buy you one. It was frugal. It was functional. It was one of the few things that kept you warm when money could not. And yes, sometimes it was embarrassing, but other times it reminded you that love could be worn and passed down. You smiled with your lips closed. That was the trick, because dentist visits were rare and cavities were not. You knew what free clinic meant. Long lines, fluorescent lights, a toothbrush in a plastic bag. Fillings hurt, pulling teeth hurt more, but ignoring them hurt the most. Poor families stretched everything, including dental visits. You only went when it was bad, real bad. And even then, You hoped it would fix itself. You learned to chew on one side, and when that side hurt, you just stopped smiling altogether. Baby teeth were left to rot because they were going to fall out anyway. Adult teeth cracked and stayed that way. Braces? Not a chance. Retainers? Another universe. You brushed with whatever toothpaste was on sale. Sometimes baking soda, sometimes nothing. Mouthwash burned like fire, but it was all you had. You learned to chew on the other side, to hide the pain, to hide your teeth. It was not neglect, it was math. A clean mouth cost too much, so you smiled small, talked fast, and hoped no one noticed. You did not buy your Halloween costume, you built it. From cardboard boxes, black trash bags, aluminum foil, and your mother's last bit of patience. One year, you were a robot made from an old cereal box and duct tape. Another year, a ghost in a sheet that used to be part of someone's bed. No one had money for plastic masks from the drugstore or glossy capes from the party aisle. You took what you had and you imagined the rest. A wire hanger turned into a pair of fairy wings. A paper plate became a superhero's shield. It was not about looking scary or cool, it was about looking like you tried. And every pair of scissors and roll of tape was an act of hope disguised as pretend. If you were lucky, someone lent you a wig or a pair of too big boots. The costume might fall apart halfway through trick-or-treating, but you did not care. It was not about perfection, it was about participation. You knocked on doors with a pillowcase, not a plastic pumpkin. And when people opened up, they smiled. Not just at your costume, but at the effort it took to get there. You were part of something, part of the street parade of creativity and duct-taped dreams. There was pride in that, even when your tinfoil hat drooped or your vampire makeup smeared before the first house. Because homemade Halloween was not about who spent the most, it was about who showed up looking ridiculous, proud, and ready for candy. There were no bounce houses, no magicians, no venues booked weeks in advance. Your birthday party was in the living room, or the backyard if the weather was nice. The decorations came from a dollar store or were made by hand the night before. Balloons were rare, streamers were reused. And the cake? Homemade, lopsided, and perfect. It came from a box mix, yellow or chocolate, topped with frosting your mom whipped together using margarine and hope. Your name was written in shaky letters, sometimes misspelled, but it still made you smile. You never knew what a store-bought cake tasted like, but you knew what it felt like to be celebrated. That one day wasn't about what you had, it was about being seen. The guest list was short, just cousins, maybe a neighbor or two. Presents were wrapped in newspaper or last year's birthday bags. Sometimes the gift was a new coat you needed for school or a pair of sneakers you had to grow into. But you still blew out the candles and made a wish. You still felt like the center of the world for that one day. You played games like musical chairs, pin the tail on the donkey, or just ran around outside until someone scraped a knee. There was no budget, but there was joy. Real, messy, homemade joy. The kind that sticks with you longer than a party at a trampoline park ever could. You did not unwrap toys. You unwrapped winter coats. You did not get video games. You got socks, gloves, notebooks for school, maybe a new backpack with a zipper that worked, for now. And you learned to smile anyway. Not because you were pretending, but because you understood. Gifts were not about fun. They were about function. You could not afford both. Your parents gave what they could, and what they could give was what you needed. There was no room for disappointment, only gratitude dressed up in ribbon. You taught yourself to get excited about necessity, because that was what love looked like in your house. Sometimes they wrapped a package of undershirts just to have something under the tree. Sometimes the big gift was a $10 bill tucked inside a handmade card. It was not much, but it meant something. It meant someone cared. Someone noticed that your shoes were falling apart, that your jeans had too many patches. On birthdays and holidays, you learned to be grateful for the basics. And maybe, in a weird way, it made those gifts matter more. Because in a poor household, nothing was taken for granted. Not the warmth of a new coat, not the smell of new pencils, not the feeling of holding something, anything that was yours alone. You did not get everything you wanted, but you got what you needed, and that was the real gift. The house never looked like the magazines, but it looked like home, because every wreath, every paper snowflake, every string of popcorn draped across the tree was made by hand. You used construction paper, glue sticks, markers, and a whole lot of imagination. Garland came from old fabric scraps. Oranges were sliced and dried for ornaments. The tree skirt was a blanket. The centerpiece was a bowl of pine cones. You made turkeys out of traced handprints and painted toilet paper rolls like snowmen. Holidays were not expensive. They were creative. Your decorations didn't sparkle, but they told stories. Every smudge, every jagged cut, every glue stain was a fingerprint of the people who made them. Your family did not buy matching place settings or elegant displays. You made do with what you had, and somehow it always felt right. The decorations changed every year because you made them every year, together. Sitting at the table, cutting, folding, taping. You laughed when things turned out crooked. You kept the best ones in a box, brought out with ceremony like they were heirlooms. And in a way, they were. Each smudged crayon mark, each uneven edge, held memories that no store-bought decor ever could. Poor did not mean joyless. It just meant your joy came with scissors and a glue bottle. You learned to unwrap carefully, slowly, delicately, because once the tape came off, the paper had to be saved, folded, tucked away for next year. Gift bags were like gold. Tissue paper, if you had it, was reused until it tore beyond repair. You knew the creases in the wrapping. You recognized the patterns, Santa with the tilted hat, snowflakes that faded at the edges. You remembered who used them last, and it did not matter. No one said anything when a birthday gift came in Christmas paper or when the tag still had someone else's name crossed out. It was part of the rhythm, a quiet tradition born out of necessity. Every reused ribbon said, "We still care." Every secondhand bow said, "This is still for you." You might not have had much to give, but you gave it well, wrapped in care, in resourcefulness, in the understanding that appearances mattered, even if they were gently recycled. There was love in every reused bag, every taped corner, every ribbon ironed out and tied again. Poor families understood. The wrapping was part of the gift. Not because it had to impress, but because it had to endure. And so it did, year after year. Limited access to cable television in the 1980s meant your world came through rabbit ears. You had the basics, network channels, maybe a grainy local station or two. But when friends talked about Nickelodeon, MTV, or the Disney Channel, you just smiled and nodded, pretending you knew what they meant. Your TV had an antenna wrapped in aluminum foil. Your Saturday mornings were for cartoons on the few channels that came in clear. You learned to adjust the rabbit ears just right, then sit perfectly still, because moving even an inch might send the screen back into static. You missed out on the cable exclusive shows, the big movie nights, the flashy channels with round-the-clock music videos. You got public access, reruns, and news that ended with the national anthem. At school, you heard about shows you never saw. You laughed along anyway. At home, you made the most of what you had. Limited channels meant fewer choices, but also fewer arguments. You watched whatever was on. You made it work. And you learned something strange. When there was only one option, it often became your favorite. The picture was not perfect, but it was yours. And sometimes, that was enough. Hot Wheels did not just roll, they roared. When Mattel launched the line in 1968, it changed the way kids thought about toy cars. These were not slow, blocky replicas. Hot Wheels were sleek, bright, and built to race. The original 16 models included muscle cars, hot rods, and custom builds with names like Beatnik Bandit and Diora. They had real speed thanks to low-friction wheels and metal axles. But the real magic came when you laid down that iconic orange track. Loops, curves, jumps. Suddenly, your hallway became Daytona. Kids spent hours building elaborate courses from couches to floorboards to staircases. Some cars went so fast they hit the baseboard and flipped into the next room. The cars were pocket-sized, but they carried the weight of imagination. Each new release felt like a discovery. Paint jobs were wild, details were sharp. Collectors started forming almost immediately. And while other toy cars looked good sitting still, Hot Wheels looked best in motion, blurring by in a flash of chrome and flame decals. For many, it was not just about racing. It was about building your own world, one piece of orange track at a time. Mood rings promised to read your soul. Slip one on, and suddenly your finger was a window into your emotions. Or so we thought. The magic came from a tiny, color-changing stone set into a thick metal or plastic band. It shifted hues depending on temperature, but as kids, we believed it told the truth. If it turned blue, you were calm. If it went black, you were angry. Green? Maybe in love. We studied those little charts that came with the ring like they were sacred scrolls. Every recess and sleepover had at least one person interpreting moods. Sure, the science was sketchy, and sure, it mostly just reflected how cold or hot your hands were, but to us, it was real magic. It felt like the ring knew something we did not. Every kid had one, lost one, or begged their parents to buy one from a gas station or gift shop. The band turned your finger green eventually, but you wore it anyway. It was a talisman, a tiny crystal mood detector that let you feel seen, even if it was just a gimmick. To this day, nothing quite compares to the mystery and wonder packed into one shimmering, shifting little stone. TV dinners turned the living room into a dining room, one foil tray at a time. They were not new in the 1960s, but this was the decade they really took off, just as television became the centerpiece of American family life. You got a little compartment for meatloaf, one for mashed potatoes, another for corn, maybe a brownie tucked into the corner. All you had to do was pop it in the oven, wait, and serve. No planning, no cleanup, no arguing over what to cook. The tray itself felt futuristic. Everything had its place. The food was not gourmet, but it was warm, salty, and comforting in its predictability. Families could eat while watching their favorite shows. Kids could feel like grown-ups with their own personal meal. The appeal was clear, fast, easy, and made to match the rhythm of modern life. TV dinners were more than just food. They were a new way to eat, one that said it was okay to sit on the couch and focus on The Ed Sullivan Show or Bonanza. The clang of a fork against aluminum still echoes in memory. For many, it was the sound of dinner and television becoming one. Shared bedrooms among siblings meant privacy was a myth and bedtime was an adventure. 2, sometimes 3 kids in one room, bunk beds, fold-out couches, mattresses on the floor. You learned to sleep through snoring, giggling, and whispered arguments over who stole the blanket. One lamp lit the room. One drawer held everyone's socks. If you wanted quiet, you closed your eyes and hoped for sleep. But there was love there too. Late-night stories, secret jokes, a flashlight under the covers. You made forts out of sheets and built walls with pillows, pretending they were rooms of your own. You learned to share without thinking, to wait your turn, to keep secrets. Sure, you fought. You drew invisible lines down the mattress. But you also looked out for each other, listened when someone cried, celebrated the nights when no one got in trouble. Those cramped quarters built closeness you never asked for, but maybe needed. And years later, you remembered those rooms not for the lack of space, but for the way they held you together. Shared bedrooms were loud, messy, and full of life. And even now, you sometimes miss what it meant to fall asleep beside someone who knew you by heart. Milk delivery boxes were part of the morning routine before grocery stores became the center of every neighborhood. In the 1960s, many American homes had a small metal box sitting just outside the front door or tucked near the back steps. Inside, the milkman would leave fresh glass bottles filled with whole milk, sometimes with cream floating at the top. It was a system built on trust and timing. Families left their empty bottles out at night, and by morning, new ones would appear, cold and ready for breakfast. The box was often insulated to keep the milk cool, and in the winter, the tops might freeze and push the cardboard caps up like little crowns. Kids raced to bring it in before it could spoil in the sun. Some deliveries even included extras: eggs, butter, cottage cheese, depending on the service. The clink of bottles in the early morning was a familiar sound, and the sight of the milkman pulling up in a white truck or on a three-wheeled cart was part of the rhythm of daily life. It was personal, reliable, and felt like a small luxury. Today, the boxes are mostly gone, rusting behind old homes or used as planters, but to those who remember, they represent a time when things felt simpler, more local, and a little more dependable, one delivery at a time. Tangy taffy was the candy you had to work for, and that was half the fun. Long before it became part of the Laffy Taffy brand, this chewy strip came in a thin plastic wrapper and offered a sweet, stretchy challenge for any sugar-loving kid in the 1960s. It came in vibrant colors and punchy flavors like grape, strawberry, and sour apple, each one delivering a jolt of sugar and just the right amount of tartness. You could bend it, stretch it, or roll it into a ball before finally taking a bite. The longer you chewed, the stronger the flavor got, which made it perfect for kids trying to make a nickel's worth of candy last the whole afternoon. Sometimes it stuck to your teeth. Sometimes it stuck to the wrapper. But it was always worth it. Tangy taffy was less about elegance and more about fun, bright, bold, and unapologetically sweet. For many kids, it was the ultimate playground treat, swapped on school buses or bought from corner stores with pocket change. Today's candies may be smoother or flashier, but they cannot match the simple satisfaction of a taffy you could stretch, fold, and chew until your jaw hurt. Using layaway plans was how your family brought home the things they could not afford all at once. The process was simple but long. You picked something out, paid a little now, and waited. Every week or every paycheck, your parents went back to the store and handed over a few more dollars. The items stayed behind the counter, out of reach, until that last payment clicked everything into place. Maybe it was a winter coat. Maybe it was a bike for Christmas. Sometimes it was furniture or shoes or something that felt big, because it was. You did not get instant gratification. You got slow, hard-earned reward. There was no credit card swipe, no overnight shipping, just weeks of waiting, hoping, and counting. You learned patience. You learned value. And when that final receipt was signed, it felt like winning something impossible. Other families might have walked out with full bags. Yours walked out with pride. Layaway meant you were not giving up. You were building towards something, one payment at a time. And even now, when you buy something in full, you still feel that echo, the deep understanding that waiting made it sweeter. Home fondue parties were peak 1960s sophistication. Cheesy, communal, and irresistibly fun. Imported from Switzerland and embraced by American hostesses everywhere, fondue turned dinner into an event. Friends gathered around bubbling pots of melted Gruyere or Emmental, long forks in hand, dipping cubes of crusty bread into molten gold. It was interactive, slightly exotic, and made conversation flow almost as much as the wine. The fondue pot itself became a household item, sleek, colorful, often gifted at weddings. There were rules. Do not drop your bread in the pot, stir in a figure eight, and keep the cheese smooth. Some added white wine or garlic, others experimented with chocolate fondue for dessert. Either way, the evening was about more than food. It was about sharing, laughing, and leaning in, literally and socially. In an era that embraced kitsch and community, fondue was a perfect fit. It brought people together in a circle, turned dinner into performance, and gave every guest a role to play. Long before tapas or charcuterie boards, fondue was the original shareable meal. For those who remember the scent of wine and cheese wafting through a mid-century living room, it was a flavor and feeling that defined the times. Long before music was digital, it spun on plastic. Record players with built-in speakers were the backbone of every teenager's room and every family living room. They were bulky, boxy, and usually brown or beige. But when you placed that needle on the groove, the room changed. You might remember hearing the Jackson 5, the Carpenters, or Fleetwood Mac for the very first time through one of these machines. The sound was warm, slightly fuzzy, and crackled at the edges, but it was alive. Kids would stack their 45s, adjust the tone arm, and lower the needle with care. These were not sleek devices. They were furniture. Some had lids that closed like a suitcase. Others had knobs you had to gently coax into the right spot. Volume? Not much. But intimacy? All the way. You sat close to it. You knew every skip and scratch on your favorite record. You could play the same song 10 times in a row and it felt new every time. It was not about convenience, it was about connection. The record player was not background noise, it was the centerpiece of your downtime. Hearing one today might just make you stop, listen, and remember who you were when that song first played. Heating only one room in winter was not just a strategy, it was survival. The whole house might be freezing, but one space stayed warm. Maybe it was the living room with a kerosene heater. Maybe the kitchen with the oven door cracked open. You brought in extra blankets. You wore your coat indoors. Everyone piled in, like penguins sharing body heat. You did homework at the coffee table, ate soup from mismatched bowls, slept on the couch or a pile of comforters laid out on the floor. The hallway felt like Antarctica. The bathroom? A short, icy sprint. At night, the cold crept into your bones, but during the day, you all huddled in that one room like it was the center of the universe. Parents told kids to keep the door shut. Do not let the heat out. No one dared argue. It was about bills, about making it to spring. And even though it felt unfair at the time, it also brought people close. Literally, you learned to share space, to pass the time, to be warm in more ways than one. Heating one room was not ideal, but it was home, and somehow it got you through. Slide projectors were the original family theater. Before smartphones and digital albums, the only way to share vacation photos was by dimming the lights, pulling down a screen or a blank wall, and clicking through a carousel of 35mm slides. You could hear the quiet hum of the machine, the mechanical clunk as each new photo dropped into place, and the occasional groan from someone who had already seen them twice. But there was magic in it. These evenings were about more than just pictures. They were about storytelling. The beach trip where Dad sunburned his feet. The blurry shot of Grandma mid-sneeze. The perfectly framed sunset over the Grand Canyon. Families would laugh, tease, and remember together, sometimes with popcorn, always with commentary. The projector cast not just images, but atmosphere, the darkened room, the warmth of shared memory, and the feeling that what you were seeing mattered because everyone else was seeing it too. Slide projectors may be obsolete now, but for those who grew up in the 1960s, they were a rite of passage, a way to relive moments in slow, glowing frames, one dusty click at a time. Shrinky dinks were magic in plastic form. You started with a sheet, clear, flexible, and begging to be colored. You grabbed your markers, drew a wild design, cut it out with safety scissors, and popped it in the oven. What came out was a tiny, hardened version of your masterpiece, often warped but always perfect. Watching it shrink behind the oven door was part of the thrill. You would kneel on the floor, peering through the glass, and gasp as your drawing curled, twisted, and finally flattened. Kids made keychains, jewelry, ornaments. Whatever their imagination allowed, it felt like crafting with sorcery. One minute you were tracing cartoons or making friendship tags. The next you held a miniaturized relic in your palm. The smell of melting plastic filled the kitchen. Parents worried, but no one stopped us. Shrinky dinks were affordable, creative, and wildly popular at every sleepover and birthday party. You could even buy branded kits, superheroes, cartoon characters, holiday themes. But the best ones were always your originals. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing your art transformed like that. Tiny, tough, and totally unique. We never questioned the process. We just knew it felt like creating something real, something small that still felt huge. Homemade school lunches in washed-out containers were the unofficial lunchbox of every frugal family. Forget the cartoon thermos or the shiny metal lunch pail. If you were poor in the 1980s, your sandwich came wrapped in wax paper and packed in an empty margarine tub. Maybe the lid said country crock, but inside was leftover spaghetti or peanut butter crackers. You used the same container every day. The label peeled, the edges warped, but it worked. Your drink? Not a juice box. Maybe a reused jelly jar with watered-down Kool-Aid. You prayed it did not leak. In the lunchroom, you sat next to kids with perfectly packed snacks, cheese sticks, pudding cups, chips with real logos. You ate quietly, or fast, or not at all. But at home, it made sense. Those containers stacked neatly in the cupboard. Your parents washed them each night and packed them again with care. It was not about shame. It was about stretching every cent. And even though you knew it was different, you also knew it was made with effort, maybe even love. Those stained lids and handwritten notes stuffed under the sandwich were signs of sacrifice. And now, all grown up, they feel like something you miss. Barrel of Monkeys was proof that the simplest ideas can last the longest. Released in 1965, the game came in a bright plastic barrel filled with plastic monkeys that linked together by their arms. That was it. No batteries, no board, no setup time. Just spill the monkeys and try to link as many as you could without dropping the chain. It was harder than it looked. The curved arms never seemed to hook just right, and one wrong move could send your whole line tumbling. But when you did it, when you made it past 10 or 15 monkeys, it felt like a small miracle. Kids would challenge each other to beat their records, dump and restart over and over, totally absorbed. The monkeys themselves were colorful, cheerful, and perfectly palm-sized. The game traveled well. It lived in car glove boxes, grandma's house drawers, and birthday party goodie bags. Decades later, the design remains almost unchanged, which says something about how right they got it the first time. Before screens took over fidget time, there was just you, a barrel, and 24 tiny monkeys daring you to beat your best. If you remember Clacker toys, you probably also remember getting smacked in the face. These were two solid acrylic balls connected by a string, meant to be swung up and down until they clacked together above and below your hand. That was the whole toy. No batteries, no screen. Just two hard spheres ready to leave a bruise. And kids loved them. The louder and faster they clacked, the cooler you were. It was a skill to master. Get the rhythm right, and you could keep them going for minutes. Get it wrong, and you got a nasty surprise. Parents hated them. Teachers banned them. Hospitals probably kept a few on hand just to demonstrate what not to do. They were loud, dangerous, and oddly satisfying. For a few wild years, clackers were everywhere, on sidewalks, in classrooms, and hidden under beds when they got taken away. Eventually, safety concerns shut them down, but not before a generation got their fill of noise and near misses. They were outlawed in some places, but that only made them cooler. If you ever got them moving just right, you remember the thrill, and maybe a headache to go with it. They were chaos in toy form, and we would not have had it any other way. Generic brand groceries were the quiet label of struggle in the 1980s. Walk into any store and you would see those plain white boxes with nothing but bold black lettering, cornflakes, macaroni, or just soup. No mascots, no cartoons, no sparkle. They sat on the bottom shelf like they were trying not to be noticed. But they were. Everyone saw them. Kids knew what they meant. If those showed up in your cart, you were not getting prizes in your cereal. You were just getting food. Some tasted okay. Some tasted like cardboard. But they filled the pantry. And that was the point. They were cheaper by quarters that mattered. Some families would peel off the labels just so the box did not scream. Others embraced them, one no-name can at a time. In school lunches, you hoped no one saw the off-brand cookies. You ate them fast, hoping they passed for the real thing. Generic brand groceries were not glamorous. They were not meant to be. But they were the invisible badge of getting by. And for the families that counted every dollar, those blank white labels were a quiet promise. You were doing what you could, and you were not alone. Corgi Toys were more than just cars. They were miniature masterpieces. Introduced by British company Metoy in the late 1950s, They reached peak popularity in the 1960s with American kids who were obsessed with anything fast, shiny, or connected to TV and movie heroes. These die-cast vehicles were small enough to fit in your pocket, but detailed enough to spark hours of imaginative play. Police cars came with real-looking sirens. Race cars had working hoods. And the crown jewel? The James Bond Aston Martin DB5, complete with ejector seat, pop-out machine guns, and a hidden bulletproof shield. For kids growing up in the 1960s, it was the coolest thing you could own. Movie magic shrunk down and placed in your palm. Corgi cars raced across kitchen floors, crashed down backyard driveways, and survived countless shoebox battles. They felt heavier than Hot Wheels, sturdier than Matchbox, and somehow more real. Over time, most got scratched, dented, or lost. But finding one today, even chipped, brings back the joy of flipping it over to read the brand stamp and revving it across a table edge. They were not just toys. They were little slices of the world, only faster. Miniskirts arrived like a fashion revolution. Short, sharp, and bold, they sliced through the conservative silhouettes of the 1950s and became the defining garment of the 1960s youth movement. Popularized by designers like Mary Quant and embraced by British mod culture, the miniskirt represented freedom, rebellion, and a new kind of confidence. It was daring but playful, feminine but fierce. Hemlines rose, attitudes shifted, and suddenly women were claiming space on the streets, on the dance floor, and in the workplace. The skirt barely reached mid-thigh, often paired with bold patterns, bright colors, or textured fabrics like corduroy and vinyl. Worn with turtlenecks or boxy jackets, it was as much about contrast as it was about comfort. Women weren't just dressing up, they were dressing out, outward, loudly, visibly. Some schools banned them. Some parents frowned. But the miniskirt kept rising in popularity and in cut. It became a uniform of sorts for women carving out new identities in a changing world. They were photographed on street corners, in protest marches, at record stores, and in the pages of glossy magazines. Photos from the time show crowds of young people in knee socks and miniskirts, smiling wide, striding forward. It was not just fashion, it was a statement. And for those who lived it, it is still stitched into the fabric of memory, one daring hem at a time. Before the sleek inline skates of the 1990s, there were the clunky, lovable roller skates with metal wheels. They strapped over your shoes with thick leather buckles and screeched across every surface like they were mad at the floor. If you skated indoors, you sounded like a marching band. If you braved the sidewalk, every crack was a threat. But none of that mattered. Because once you got going, it was freedom. You were flying, wobbling, yes, but flying. These skates had no padding, no ankle support, and no mercy. But they came with memories, rolling through driveways, circling the garage, racing your siblings until someone wiped out. You remember the sound they made on concrete, the clatter as you tried to stop, the feeling of falling and getting back up anyway. Roller discos made them iconic. Kids and teens glided under colored lights, surrounded by Bee Gees and Donna Summer, feeling cooler than they ever had. You might have never mastered the spin. You probably fell more than you want to admit. But those skates, those metal-wheeled monstrosities, were the soundtrack to a whole chapter of growing up. They were heavy, loud, and impossible to forget. Limited extracurricular activities were just another way the world reminded you what you could not afford. Other kids had piano lessons, karate classes, and sports teams with matching uniforms. You had afternoons at home watching TV or playing outside with a stick and a rock. Sign-up fees were too high. Equipment cost too much. Even the rides to practice were out of reach if the car was needed for work. You brought home the flyers from school and left them on the table, hoping. Sometimes they just disappeared. Sometimes your parents gently explained that maybe next time meant probably never. You cheered from the sidelines, you watched from the crowd, and you learned how to clap with a smile even when your heart wanted in. It was not fair, it stung, but you found other ways to grow. You read library books, you drew comics in the margins of your notebook, you played tag until the sun went down, and maybe you missed out on trophies and tournaments, But you learned resilience, creativity, and how to find joy in the quiet spaces. You might not have worn the jersey, but you still showed up, and that mattered. Space food sticks were NASA's answer to snacking and the 1960s answer to cool. Developed with the help of the Space Agency and manufactured by Pillsbury, these chewy, tube-shaped snacks were inspired by the meals eaten aboard spacecraft during America's race to the moon. They came in flavors like chocolate, peanut butter, and caramel, each one individually wrapped in sleek foil packaging that looked straight out of a science fiction movie. For kids, biting into a space food stick meant pretending you were floating in zero gravity, eating like an astronaut in orbit. They were soft, dense, and slightly grainy. Less candy bar, more futuristic fuel. Parents loved the idea of a high-protein, shelf-stable snack. Kids just liked the novelty. They made it into lunchboxes, road trip bags, and even Halloween candy stashes. Though their popularity waned by the 1980s, the memory stuck, especially for those who watched grainy broadcasts of moonwalks and then unwrapped their own little taste of space. Today, space food sticks are remembered more for what they represented than how they tasted. They were not just snacks. They were a bite of the future, wrapped in foil, waiting in your kitchen drawer. If any of this brought back a memory you forgot you were carrying, tell us in the comments, hit that like button like it owes you lunch money, and subscribe so you never lose the stories that made us.